So now we come to the last formal part before the Q&A, and that is actually Mark Rosegrant is going to give us some reflections, I guess, on both of what he heard and how it relates to his work. And yeah, so please welcome Mark Rosegrant, the Director of the Environment and Production Technology Division. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, and thanks especially for all my friends and colleagues who spoke here. It's a tough act to follow, and all the friends and colleagues here in the audience as well. Especially thank my family members here, my wife Susan, my son Michael, who took a bus from Boston to come down here to see me, and my sister Ann and brother-in-law Tony, who also surprised me driving down from Ann Arbor for this. So really extra surprised. So I guess I'm going to reflect mostly, I guess, on a little bit on my career and IFPRI, but touching on some of the issues that we saw. Yeah, I think I'm going to take a little bit longer than my 5-minute allotment, since that would only give me 8 seconds per year I've been at IFPRI. So that didn't seem quite fair. But I won't ramble on too long. Well, first of all, I mean, contrary to popular belief, I did have a job after my PhD and before I joined IFPRI. So from 1978 to 80, I was an economist under a USAID project in the Philippines, posted in what was then the Department of Agriculture in the Philippines. And it was really there that I learned the critical importance of working carefully with data, understanding when data makes sense and when it doesn't, and also the excitement of operating within a fast-paced environment, working with the policy analysis staff that was directly attached to the Secretary of Agriculture then. So I learned not only a lot about economics and economics, but I also learned that research and policy work can actually be fun, and that's something I think we sometimes don't manage to do. I first heard about IFPRI actually when I was doing my PhD field research, and that was at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines in Los Baños in 1976. At that time, 2 IFPRI staff were visiting IFPRI. This was only about a year after IFPRI was established. So speaking to them, I mean, it really seemed like the most thrilling job possible, and I think it probably has been overall. And then a couple of years later, IFPRI had an opening for someone that with expertise in water resources and irrigation, which I had done some work on for my dissertation. So I applied while still based in Manila at that job at the Department of Agriculture. And an indication how different many things were in those days. I was given an offer from IFPRI's director at that time, John Mellor, without ever having spoken to him or having an interview. So I had some pretty good recommendations. So I made one attempt to negotiate the salary because I had also received a higher salary from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, ERS, at that time. So when I asked Telex John asking for higher compensation, I received a really quick reply back, also by Telex. The offer stands as is, stop, take it or leave it, stop. And I took it, and now I'm still here. So the IFPRI that I joined was, of course, really different from what it is today. When it first started in '75, it had 5 senior staff, 12 short-term consultant associates, and a support staff of 10, and a budget of $5 million over 5 years. By the time I joined, which is then in 1980, it had grown some. We already had, at that point, programs that sort of, in a sense, were the genesis of many of the current programs. There was a program on trends analysis. That one kind of disappeared over the year, but production investments, food consumption, distribution, and trade and food security. So as you can see, 3 of the 4 research divisions here really had their genesis way back then. The one that's evolved differently was the Development Strategies division, which was became part of the Production division, and of course evolved on its own back in 2003. I think when IFPRI started, it was not part of the CGIAR at all. There was a lot of controversies, in fact, about IFPRI joining the CGIAR. Many of the senior people in the centers, as well as many donors, did not see the relevance of Policy Institute working with basically scientific institutes. There's also opposition to the fact that IFPRI was proposing to do a lot of work in trade policy. There was suspicion that a Washington-based trade policy institute would favor U.S. policies against others, and that also made opposition. But fortunately, by 79, the IFPRI was admitted into the CG about 5 years after it started. And at that point, the budget ballooned from $1.7 million in 79 all the way to $6.1 million in 84. So it was still a very small place at that time. But then through the 1980s, obviously, as we've all seen, IFPRI grew strongly in most years and incredibly rapidly other years to the very large institution we are today. Through the 1980s, research on agriculture production issues at IFPRI focused more on things like what farm producer investment incentives can achieve growth and equity simultaneously, what relative weight should be given to different agricultural commodities in the future, what is the role of fertilizer policy and and what are the sources of agricultural productivity growth. So that was already a lot, thinking about some of the same things that we've been hearing about already today. At the same time, during that period, I think IFPRI was relatively slow in recognizing the importance of environmental and sustainability issues in agricultural development. What had been the Production Technology Program was renamed the Environment and Production Technology Division in 1992, and even that came with reluctance from many researchers who said that emphasis would end up detracting from needed research on agriculture growth and production. So it really has been an evolution, but then I think beginning when Peter Hazel became director of the division, in about, I think, 92, and then we started building stronger programs in environmental resources. I developed a strong water resources program in the 90s with Ruth Meinsendick, Mark Svensson, and later Claudia Ringler. Other good work is being done on poverty and the environment. And sustainable land management work was initiated by John Pender and Ephraim and Konya in the mid-90s too. Later on, there's excellent work on agricultural biodiversity. And then when I ended up succeeding Peter, who moved on to become director of the Development Strategies and Governance Division, then I also put a lot more emphasis on those kinds of issues. And I think a really important breakthrough for us was when we initiated research on climate change in agriculture, really just in 2008, and in the 10 years since have built a very strong program. I think one key event I wanted to highlight, because it really was a transitional event at IFPRI, was when Per Pinstrup Anderson launched the 2020 vision for agriculture, food, and the environment. That was in 1993. So while the 2020 vision built on ongoing IFPRI research, it placed much more emphasis, first of all, on contentious or emerging issues, but also put a very heavy emphasis on communications to decision makers, to media, and elsewhere. Again, this actually ended up with some significant internal dissent at the time, with people protesting sort of what was seen already as a move away from IFPRI being a sort of straight research institute to a broader institute that would be more visible and relevant in food policy and food security debates. And I think that was a key breakthrough when we went ahead with that. And I think IFPRI's built on those gains for the last couple of decades. This also coincidentally with 2020 Vision was the start of the impact model that I started at that time with colleagues Mercy Sambilia and Nicholas Strato-Paris, who developed that with me. Yeah, I actually thought when we did that, we made a report for 2020 Vision, presented the results. I thought that was it. That was a once-off model, and I'd go back to doing other kinds of research. But the demand was very high, as you can see, and then it just kept growing after that. We had key developments. We're adding the water supply and demand models in 1998 to 2000, and then adding climate change to the model as well. So it has had sort of a life of its own under that. Let me just say a few things about what I consider my favorite papers over the years that also, I think, contributed to some of the issues here. Well, the first would be my paper in 1981 at the American Journal of Agricultural Economics with Bob Hurt on the impacts of credit policy and fertilizer subsidy in the Philippines. That was a pretty good paper, but for me, the main importance of that, it actually showed that I could publish in a good journal. I mean, it wasn't all clear to me at that point that I could. So another paper with Jim Rumasat in 1985, also in HIE, it was kind of a quirky paper, but I think it had really good lessons. This looked at, assessed the effectiveness of ZOLA, which at that time was a highly touted nitrogen-fixing algae for use in rice paddies, and was being pushed hard by the Philippine government to replace chemical fertilizers. It sounded like a good idea. You take away the chemical fertilizers, you have a naturally producing algae that that produces organic fertilizer. But we showed that the labor costs of using a ZOLA, tending it, putting it in the paddy and stuff, were far too high to justify extension of the technology. So that paper not only started my long-term interest in innovative technologies, but also showed me the need to be very skeptical until the benefits of those technologies are assessed through careful work. My paper with Hans Binswanger in 1994 on markets and tradable water rights was the first attempt to make a case for tradable water rights in developing countries. And, you know, I think we made a great case for it. It's been a widely read paper, but unfortunately has very little impact on the ground in developing countries, because there really is deep-seated opposition in developing countries to making water tradable or economic good in any way. I still think, though, that that's a key for example, getting away from the grain fundamentalism that Prabhu talked about by being able to price water so it's used more effectively in its highest valued uses. Prabhu already mentioned the paper that's also on agricultural commercialization and diversification, that we may have been too optimistic, but I think that paper also laid out a conceptual framework for diversification issues and commercialization that remains valid today and is still being used. In 1998, my paper with Faisal Casarino and again Nicostrato Perez here on output response to prices and public investment in agriculture in Indonesian crops was published in the Journal of Development Economics. And that one showed that the rapid agricultural growth in Indonesia in the 70s and 80s, that was really a miracle country during those days. It was driven almost entirely by investments in agriculture research and extension and in irrigation, not by pricing and fertilizer subsidies that were being used to distort the ag sector there. So it made a clear case that it's productivity enhancing investments that were important, not distorting food prices and fertilizer prices. In 2000, Peter Hazel and I published Transforming the Rural Asian Economy, the Unfinished Revolution, and that book was sponsored by the Asian Development Bank. It helped convince the bank for a number of years then to increase investment in the agriculture sector, which had been declining in the past. So I've always felt that was a very high impact one. My book was Ziming Kai and Sarah Klein in 2002 on world water and food to 2025, looked at alternatives and long-term scenarios and drawing investment and policy implications for those, and showed the strong interrelationship between water scarcity policy and food security. And this has been my highest cited publication with 881 citations, so that one's been out there. Then finally, just mention one more. In 2017, I keep trying to come back to water markets, and I came back full circle in two papers with Man Li and Wenchao Zhu that demonstrated more formally, theoretically, and empirically that tradable water rights do provide higher incomes to farmers than any other allocation mechanisms under any really plausible shapes of irrigation production and cost function. So I'm still trying. Let's see if anything ever comes to it. But you know, our careers are not just about research, and perhaps certainly one of the most fulfilling parts of my career has been working with and mentoring young researchers, particularly in Asia, where I worked for many years. And I've had many relationships working with people from the time they were just out of their PhDs and their masters on through many years of their career. And a lot of my colleagues have gone on to very important positions, directors of research institutes or university faculties, deputy ministers of agriculture or finance. the Minister of National Economic Development in the Philippines before. In one case, the Vice President of Indonesia was an old colleague of mine. So that kind of long-term work has always been great. I haven't really had a traditional, like, long-term mentor that's helped me through my career, but I've instead been blessed with many superb mentors and collaborators at various points in my careers. The earliest on, Randy Barker, Bob Hurt, and Yujiro Hayami were economists at IFPRI when I was doing my PhD research there, and I learned a tremendous amount from them. I also met Jim Rumaset, actually, while I was doing my PhD work then, and he's been a colleague and mentor ever since, really, and we wrote several very good papers together as well. Other key mentors at different important parts of my career were Hans Binswanger and Bob Evanson. I think Bob was particularly important during a relatively low productivity part of my career. He helped me get back on track through some great work we did together, and I'll always be grateful to him. I also, of course, learned from great collaborators such as Prabhu, who we heard from, Jugun Huang here, Arsenio Balisakan, and of course from all my IFPRI colleagues here, even Stan Wood. So, I've also been uniquely blessed and benefited by working for great bosses throughout my career, including John Meller, Per Spencer Anderson, Raisuddin Ahmed, who was my first division director, Joachim von Braun, Peter Hazel, who was then my other division director, and then, of course, Schengen Fan here in front. You know, from the time I started until now, I've been given tremendous freedom to develop my own work. And, well, I wasn't supposed to do this. And more directly, the work of the division as well. And you know, having that freedom to grow and take your own way while contributing to the good of all is sort of the definition of a great career. And thank you, Schengen, and all the others. You've supported me tremendously these last several years, and I'll always be grateful for that. So I've already thanked most of my family, also my daughter Melissa and son Joselito, who have always been extremely supportive and patient with huge demands of my time and the crazy travel schedules of this kind of the kind of work we do here at IFPRI. So thanks you all very much, and it's not really going to be goodbye. You know, I'll be hanging around, and I'll see you all around, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thanks so much for, very, very great reflections, I guess, both on IFPRI, reflections on IFPRI and on Mark's career. I think we've all learned a lot. So I learned a lot, certainly about the early years and how difficult it was to even join CGR for IFPRI. I knew there were issues with our trade policy research from the beginning, and I guess those issues probably will never go away.